All right, everyone, we're live.
Great. It is 9:04. We have a quorum. I'd like to call this meeting to order. It's the Weston Public School Board of Education Budget Workshop number 2. Actually, before we continue on the budget deliberations this morning, one thing I'd like to do is really go through the budget calendar. I think there was some questions about the calendar, how the budget process works after our first meeting. So I thought I'd just spend a few minutes going through it, kind of big picture, so everyone really understands how the entire process works. If you basically look at the months of January, February, March, and April, and you break it down into months, right? January is the month where the BOE, the Board of Ed, deliberates on the budget. We had a formal presentation on the 6th. We had our first 4-hour workshop on the 7th. We will have another workshop today, which is the 13th. We will probably be discussing some items related to the capital budget at the Finance Committee tomorrow morning on the 14th. On the 18th, which is our monthly meeting, there'll probably be an agenda item on there, which is related to the budget as well, to continue our discussion on the budget. That's an opportunity also for the public to be able to comment on anything, including the budget, in the public comment section on the 18th prior to our board meeting. On the 20th, we have another opportunity for the public to weigh in on the budget through a public forum. That's a Q&A, and that will be, several hours to the extent that the public has questions. After the public gets through with the Q&A, board members can continue their deliberation if we have time. And then on the 24th, and the 25th, we have an additional workshop. And on the 26th, if we're all ready, we need to approve and adopt the budget and pass it on to the Board of Selectmen. We need to pass on the budget to the Board of Selectmen by the end of the month. So where we are today is really still in the fact-finding mode. I think that after the 20th, when we hear from the public, we'll kind of move into more of a discussion around approval and adoption, and hopefully by the 25th, we're ready to vote on the budget. The month of February is really a month dedicated to the Board of Selectmen deliberation. We have 2 meetings with the Board of Selectmen, one on the 8th of February, one on the 15th. Where we review the budget with the Board of Selectmen, and the Board of Selectmen ultimately on the 22nd will recommend the Board of Ed budget. We'll have a recommendation for the Board of Ed budget to pass on to the Board of Finance. The month of March is the Board of Finance deliberation. We have 2 meetings with the Board of Finance to review the budget. On the 7th and on the 15th of March. On the 29th, there is another opportunity for the public to weigh in. There'll be a public hearing on the town and combined town and Board of Ed budget. On the 31st, the Board of Finance will continue their budget deliberation. And on the 31st and on the 7th of April, and by the 7th of April, they will vote on a final budget. So the month of April, actually, there's really nothing going on until the 28th, where is our annual town budget meeting, and then the public gets to vote on the budget at a referendum, which is slated for the 7th of May. And so, you'll see that, after we get through on the Board of Ed budget, there's still several months of deliberation and several opportunities for the public to weigh in on the budget before it goes to referendum. I hope this kind of clarify some questions. As you can see, there's a lot of eyes on the budget, but both public eyes as well as, at the end of the day, there's 17 elected officials between the Board of Education, the Board of Selectmen, and the Board of Finance that are really opining on the school budget, in addition to several opportunities for the public to weigh in before it goes to a town vote. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit of the budget deliberation and process from here until May.
Dr.
Lisa?
Pesco, can I add that the principals and I will also be meeting with the various PTOs in the month of January. So that affords the families another opportunity. There is a joint PTO meeting between Hurlbut and the intermediate school on January 19th in the morning. The middle school is actually the morning of the 20th, which is the same day as the public forum, and the high school PTO meeting is on February 4th. So that's an additional opportunity for families to get their questions answered and to look at the budget through the lens of that particular school. In addition, as superintendent, I'm going to be visiting each one of the schools. I'm sending out the dates after this meeting to provide time during the specific in the middle of the day when the entire staff at some point has lunch. If anybody has any questions about the budget also, because I know that there are people that might appreciate a one-on-one opportunity or in a small group to get some clarifying questions answered at the staff level. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Lisa. Agenda for today, we have a stop at 12 today, so we have about 3 hours. My recommendation, we have about 30 pages of written Q&A to go through, and in addition to, so if you look at the time, we have 3 hours today. We also probably should put an agenda item in our monthly meeting if we need any additional time to go through any budget items that we don't cover today. And so between today and Tuesday, we should probably be able to cover the Q&A and also any additional questions that the board members may have on any other line items in the budget book. And hopefully that'll set us up nicely for the public forum. And then once we get through the public forum, hopefully we'll have input from the public. We will have done our fact finding, and we should basically be going into that final week, beginning of the final week, ready to really deliberate on and adopt a budget. So I don't know if anyone has a view on that, kind of those priorities, or how we might want to tackle the next couple of meetings. But that was kind of my recommendation, and how to go through the remaining material and set us up for to be able to really, have a good discussion and adoption on the 24th and 25th. All right. So Phil, Lisa, how do you want to do how do you want to go through the Q&A? You want to start at the beginning?
We can, if you would like, we can start at the very beginning with any questions. We really tried to get these questions answered as fully as possible ahead of schedule for the calendar, so to provide you with as much information. And if there's additional information, or it's something is not as complete, or there's still clarification in our answers, please don't hesitate to ask. So we can start there. There is one thing I want to say that I made a mistake on in my presentation that I want to clarify, and that is that the district school psychologist that we are putting forward is not funded by the Assert. funds, by the federal funds, that is actually part of the operating budget. And it's a reallocation of staff that we, it's a reallocation of FTE, quite frankly, across the district. So I apologize for that. That was an oversight on my part. In my presentation, I kept saying it was Assert funds. It is not. It's part of the operating budget, which is important to note because that means that the position doesn't disappear. Would you like to start with the question, Dr. Pesco, or what would you like to do?
Yeah, I think on Assert, right? On Assert,
Sure.
It looks like all of the grant related, I think the questions really centered, and maybe Phil, these questions centered around sort of going through the grants, when they're going to run out, what the head count is is associated with those grants, and what the expectation is for the FTE movement as these grants move through time, right? So I think all of these questions seem to be centered around trying to really get to the bottom of, okay, let's lay out all the grants, figure out which ones are going to sunset, and what does the FTE movement look like as these grants move through time. So maybe start with that, Phil, which I think will answer probably the bulk of the questions.
If I can jump in first, and then maybe Phil can talk numbers, because I'll kind of explain it in sort of lay terms, if you will.
Yeah.
If you look at our grant revenue, the document that we sent out in answer to that, the first question, we have all of the grants specified, and we have reoccurring grants, which is the whole first part. I think that the part of the concern is also in the non-reoccurring grants and what happens to that allocated, those allocations as it relates to FTE. Am I correct there, or am I going too fast?
Yeah.
Okay,
No, that's right.
So if you look at that and you see, projected revenue, we've had open choice, that's part of who we are, the adult education, the team, all the Title 1, 2, 3.
So
4.
are you looking at, I'm
looking at the grant revenue page where it just.
So that's the back in the Q&A pack, right? It's one of the,
so if you take your Q&A and you separate the questions, and then you have all of the attachments, it's in the correct order. So if you separate it and you look at question 1, the top page of the backup should be that grant revenue and FTE.
Perfect.
Am I explaining myself okay?
Yep, got it.
Okay, so you look at the grant revenue and FTE, and it's kind of spelled out, and we can certainly expand on the ones that are reoccurring. On the second page of that's where the non-reoccurring grants are listed. And if you can see that those grants are going away for the 24 school year, that's it. Assert is done. The ARP Assert, the SPED Assert, however you want to refer to it. The next page has the non-reoccurring grants. This is page 3. It has a purple title and a green title, and it's called the non-reoccurring Assert grants in 2024. And what we tried to do by illustrating that was specifically the amount of intervention that in 2023 we have, what percentage is it of the Assert, what percentage is of the operating, and then how moving forward in 2024, we are looking at how to make it, if you will, budget neutral. So, for example, when you look at the math Assert at Hurlbut Elementary School, and you see that it was 0.4, we combined it with the 0.6 in the operating to have a 1.0 for next year's budget. Remember also, there is now a curricular instructional leader specifically in math in Hurlbut in that building that's part of the operating budget. So that is the support for the math intervention, which is teaching, as well as the cell position. The year after that, what we did was we went to a budget neutral position of a 0.6 at Hurlbut, which is basically what the operating budget is, where we tweaked it was at the intermediate school by, our best prediction of being able to, for example, reduce the reading intervention at the middle school and to add that to the operating budget for the intermediate school to ensure that, when you look at 0.6 in those three buildings, basically it's 0.2 per grade level, if you wanted to look at it that way. Now, the thing about the 2024 operating budget, which we had a lengthy discussion about with the administrative team, is this is our best prediction.
Mhm.
However, we have to follow the data and look very carefully we're looking very carefully at the data and the student performance all along the way. And that speaks to, there was another question at the end, and Dr. Craw inserted how do you know it's working, if you will, and all of the formative assessments and the summative assessments. So that operating budget at this point are very good thoughts around that. That does not mean that within the operating budget of 2024, we may have to reallocate, we may have to increase a little bit in intervention. We just don't know. Because our hope is that between the professional development, the new materials, the coaching models, the interventions that we are providing at a very high level this year and next year, that we will be in a much better place as far as the amount of intervention, both the push-in model, because sometimes those teachers push in, and the pull-out model for specifically math and reading. It's hard to predict, but the what we will use as the evidence is those metrics, and that's why the Tableau software and Dan DeVito's help with that, so that the teachers can see the growth. We can anticipate the needs by this spring and early fall when we do another assessment. We'll have a much better sense of how well our interventions are working. So that's kind of the background for the people, if you will, behind the FTA and the distribution.
So let me take a stab. Let me take a stab at saying that back to you.
Sure.
Okay. So if you look at that page, to go back to page 1 in the appendix, right?
Correct.
So for 22-23, we have approximately 662,000 of reoccurring grants and 521,000 of grants that are going to are only going to be intact for this year. Okay. Against the reoccurring grants, we have 12.7 headcount, which is 642,000 versus let's draw a line between the 642,000, and that's funded by the 662,000, right, of reoccurring grant, right? Okay, so that gives us, there's 20,000 here. That's a difference, right? Now on the non-reoccurring grants, if you go to page 2, there's 6.8 headcount, totaling 464,000, right? That would be against the 520 grants that are sunsetting, right?
Yes.
Phil, do I got this right?
I'm following it. Phil, is that?
Correct, Tony. That's exactly what it is.
All right. So now, so I get it. And so if you go back to the staffing page, right, that you have between, in the budget book, right, that 6.8 and 12.7 should be somewhere that adds up to 19.5, right?
Yes.
Which probably doesn't match exactly the 18.5. I don't know. I don't have that budget book, but I remember 18.5 there, right? Difference.
Yeah, there's probably a difference of probably 1 FTE because from the open choice perspective, we have that person
Okay.
in our operating budget, and the open
Okay.
choice just serves as an offset.
All right. And so basically what we are saying is that when the grants, according to this, then when you basically go back into the budget book, you're basically saying when, all things being equal from a budget perspective, when these grants drop off, we will be approximately headcount flat to last year's budget.
Just one clarifying point here. When the budget does fall off, when the Assert funding expires in 24, there are 4 FTEs for paraprofessionals, which will come back to the operating budget. Those are the only 4 that will come back. If you look in the various pages for paraprofessionals, you'll see a significant reduction in that line for paraprofessional budget to budget. And pretty much the grant is pretty much picking up for those FTEs. So
but those won't come, meaning that's part of what's funded. The paraprofessionals
No, in terms of the paraprofessional, the para educators that are funded on an annual basis, on a recurring basis, you're really looking at about a 9.5 FTEs.
Right.
So correct. So when you look at when you get down now to the ARP Assert, like where you see those paraprofessionals, you have an ARP Assert one paraprofessional there for SPED, and wherever it is in the non-recurring grants where a paraprofessional is listed, those paraprofessionals will flow back to the operating budget. And what we try to do in the pro forma, which is on the next page, is that we have listed, or I think I'm not even quite sure what page on this. There's a page that listed the pro forma, and it does show an increase in operating budget of about $130,000 for those 4 paraprofessionals.
I don't see 4 though. I see just 1.
So
I see.
There are 2.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I see. So those are, okay.
So in terms of exposure, in terms of let's call it the fiscal cliff, we're exposed to $130,000 from grant funding expiring.
I see.
However, isn't it true that the number of SPED paraprofessionals equates with the need, correct, Tracy? The need for those positions.
Of course,
So
I think
we
this
would
is
like to be optimistic,
yeah.
But we're being cautiously realistic.
This is not. I think that the discussion of need is a different discussion. This is trying to see what you don't want to be I think we want to be very, very clear about what our exposure is once the grant funding rolls off. I think if there's a need, there's a need, and we have to find room for it. But I think this is one of understanding what our exposure potentially is.
Understood.
It's a classic mistake when we get grants to staff up and then not have them sustainable. And I know you get that, Lisa.
Yeah.
Can I just ask, as we go through the process today, I think it would be really helpful. I just made a note of any costs that we know are going to flow back into the budget next year. So I have written down so far roughly $130,000. I know that number can change if we don't need that staff. It could go down. If we need more than that staff, it can go up. As we go through the workshop today, I guess the question is for you, Phil. Are there other known dollar amounts that would be helpful for us to know now that you anticipate are currently offset by grants, ESSER, or whatever the case may be, that are known or expected to flow back into us for next fiscal year?
Now, in terms of other funds or other exposure that we have, and again, this is all sort of kind of being optimistic, right? So, and again, so based on the language of the grant, especially the ARP ESSER grant for SPED, we're using it based on the guidelines that we have. in terms of money that could potentially come back on the pro forma that we have in the appendix. We're also showing $105,000 from a non-FTE perspective that could potentially come back to the operating budget. And those relate to items that we've used to mitigate our current operating budget. For example, we have $35,000 for professional services, another $35,000 that we have earmarked for transportation. And there's also $47,000 for tuition, and also ESY of $23,000. So in terms of mitigating, so you're right. So again, we never try to use a grant for non-recurring expenditures, but in a given year and given the amount of funds that we have to find the various ways that we can to help to mitigate our current budget. There's not a lot of areas that we have in terms of non-recurring expenditures that we could apply to the various grants that we have, primarily as it relates to SPED.
Okay.
So David, in terms of exposure, we're really looking at about $235,000.
Thanks, Bill.
So is there other questions about what the head counts are against the grants and how they're rolling off and potential exposure?
I guess it's just a question of how dependent we become on those FTEs and how critical they become to the way we do our work. And that doesn't mean that we should say, well, sorry, the money's run out, they're no longer critical, or, we have to get rid of critical people. It's just that if we don't have a long game in mind for how to retain them, then, we have exposure.
Yeah, I don't want, honestly, the discussion is not a discussion that says, oh, when the grant funding rolls off, those heads have to be reduced. Well, I think it's more of understanding where we're going with them and not being totally transparent about the fact that we have to actually, at the end of this year, I'm sure there's going to be a view of reevaluating how we've done and what the needs are going into next year, right? I mean, so I think this is more about transparency, not about making a decision today about what the needs are going to be next year, right? Or the year after.
Well, exactly. As I said, we have to, measure it. And the teachers that are involved in, especially math and reading, especially math, all have goals for that. Grade level teams have goals for that. The data teams are continually looking at it. This is a process, and we can't just, we think we need some more. Well, what's that based on? What are we basing on our intervention on the needs? And that has to be looked at extremely carefully. We have to be good stewards of this grant funding, as well as with the operational budget. And, we will continue to monitor, and we have 3 more key check-in points before next year's budget to see.
Lisa, I do have a related question. So because we are using some of because we can get interventionists through the ESSER funding, do you have any sense for next fiscal year, if we go into it with the presumption there's not going to be ESSER funding, or some, maybe it's going to be, maybe there will be an ESSER 4, who knows? But I mean, it's pretty clear our students have needs that have come from the COVID pandemic. If that funding goes away, and do we look at other places? Does the district prioritize, for example, we get to a point where we have a maximum head count that we can budget for or pay for? Do we wind up in a situation where you'll evaluate across the board needs? And if we need these interventionists and it's not going to be funded, we have to, or you have to look someplace else in the budget where there's something that might not be as necessary? Is that how it would work if we wound up in a situation where we needed to maintain that additional staffing?
Let me see if I understand, David. Are you saying that if we didn't have the $345,000 for the interventionist, what would we do? Is
Next
that
year.
kind of you mean
Or
the
the year after next.
2024? Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'll tell you that this is our best thinking right now in January with how to use the ESSER funding in September, as far as the way we're dividing it up. We may see based come June that we might want to even tweak it right then. And so these numbers are not, I would say, set in stone, because it is so important to be able to be fluid and make sure that the needs meet, that the staffing meets the needs where they are. So let's say an example where the middle school has made such tremendous gains in reading, as evidenced by, the performance in fifth grade that's coming up and the current sixth, seventh, and eighth graders, that we do not need 1.5 reading intervention in 2023. That would be a bit of a push, but for our purposes of discussion, let's say we could cut that by 0.5. Then we have to go back and see where do we use that funding in the most responsible way to get the best academic return on investment. So we need intervention. We know we need intervention. We know we have areas that are critical that we have to focus on. That's what we have, by the data analysis this summer that I did, it's very clear that we do. That being said, the responsibility that we have is to use it to meet the needs. If we find, for example, that the intervention at WIS is not enough in reading, then maybe we have to regroup and put it over there. But it will all depend on looking at the data, looking at the evidence of the student performance, and how best to make those decisions.
So I guess what I'm asking is, I think you said this, so in the 23-24 budget, so essentially this time next year, we work on the presumption, say that there will be no ESSER funding. At that point, you'll be looking at how our students have done academically, how they have done socially, emotionally.
Sure.
And at that point, if there isn't grant money, you have to go and look at, are there places that you can offset this higher need, or
we have to figure it out. Correct.
Yeah.
And that's why we want to maintain in the operating budget for next year pieces of the intervention. Because look, we know historically, and I would turn to the principals, especially at the elementary schools, that we need interventions, correct? We need interventions. They have to get a solid foundation. So it's a question of the model and what it looks like. And that is determined by also the allocation.
And just for clarity, because I scratched my head, just for anyone who's in the public watching, the concept of intervention is not necessarily a psychologist. It's actually more like a tutor.
Academic.
Right. Because at first when I heard that, I was like, why do we have so much, so many needs at the lower levels? And then I understood the term interventionist was more,
yes,
more like a tutor.
So I'll give you an example. Adrian, I don't know her new name, Dianoso or Dunn, is a math interventionist now at the intermediate school. And Patty, feel free to jump in. When I walk through the hall and I see her, Adrian can be in a classroom with 4 students, working with them specifically on math skills that are basically dictated by the student's performance. And then later in the day, you can find Adrian in Marilyn Harasik's math class, helping her within the class, working with certain students. So it's that kind, both push in and pull out. Patty, would you like to add something to that?
Nope, that's exactly what she does. She goes where the needs are and meets students where they are. You have to also remember, we've had many new students come into our district over the last couple of years, and they come from different math programs. And so so it's not just our students that we brought through from kindergarten. So that's where we're trying to meet all their needs.
And the point of having the CIL this year now at Hurlbut then gives, the one person that was going between 2 buildings time to actually breathe and address the needs. So I think of what Carolyn does. Patty, can you elaborate on that? What I've seen her do in the classes? Like
So
Marilyn
also
and
meets
Sharon.
Carolyn meets with the teachers. She meets with the team leaders. The grade levels. She pushes in. She models lessons. She works with students. So she's going. In addition to part of her job is also science, but all of her math is dedicated to helping our teachers be the best math teachers they can be.
So you'll see these teacher interventionists flexing all the time, all over, going in, coming out, working at data teams. That's what their role is.
There was a question about other uses of ESSER funds, especially from a capital, can we use it for capital? I guess the question is, do we, we've used it for interventions.
Sure. If you look at answer 6, we kind of went through the specific reasons.
Yeah.
The important part of answer 6, I think, is that you need to look at what the other DERGs got, the other schools got. Like, for example, someone said to me, a parent reached out, an elementary parent was like, Westport is getting this project adventure course or some something that a piece of equipment that was a substantial amount of money. Well, look how much they received in ESSER funds. Weston did not get as much as other districts. So obviously we had to prioritize, and our prioritize would be right into the classroom, as well as the social emotional supports for our ESSER funds. A very small piece was used for, supplies and things like that, but that's a very small piece. Tracy, can you elaborate a little bit when we talk about the whole idea of mental health services, and that piece to kind of try to make it come to life a little bit more of those fundings with consultants and things like that? How does that look? How does that actually look in the district?
Are you talking about ESSER funding specifically or mental health
Yes.
support in general? Okay.
I'm talking about the specific use of some of those funds where it says like a consultant or et
Sure.
cetera.
So we knew we were going to see increases in mental health needs this school year, which we have definitely seen. So we have a consultant who is working with our mental health teams across the district a couple of times a month to basically help to build capacity and also to help them as a team problem solve specific challenges that they're facing. That could mean that, wow, we're really seeing an increase in anxiety at a particular set of grade levels. What are some of the strategies that we should be thinking about building wide, or what are some of the strategies that we should be thinking about for specific students who are really struggling? The model for that consultation is that there are meetings between the two elementary schools meet together, meaning the psychologists and counselor. We have one counselor at WIS, are one meeting. The middle school mental health team, counselors, social worker, and psychologists have a separate meeting because the middle school has some unique needs given that population. And then there are two sets of meetings for the high school. One is focused on the high school as a whole, and again includes social workers, psychologists, counselors. And then there's another meeting devoted to alternative pathways and the specific supports and strategies that are required within that. I think it has been a helpful model. I have gotten positive feedback about that model across the district. And it's something that I think, again, not only helps with immediate need, but also helps us to strengthen our resources and our capacity over time.
As I said, there was a very small portion. We're talking about currently this year that we're using for safety materials. Phil, I don't know if you want to shed on any light on that. It's about 25,000.
Yeah, we did use that money to primarily, the bulk of that money did go to improve ventilation or air circulation for many of the school or of the locations that currently do not have adequate ventilation because of just how the buildings were originally built. So that's primarily where the vast majority of that money went.
I think this is an opportunity. Actually, we're going to be talking about capital projects, but this is also an opportunity to make sure that we put forward a comprehensive list of capital priorities for all the schools, right? To the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance. And
Correct. We did make some revision to the capital list, Tony. I guess we can discuss that first on tomorrow, and then we can have a broader discussion at the next board meeting, however which way you want to handle that one.
yeah, I mean, if we have time today, if we get to that, we'll do that. You know, we're going to do it at the Finance and Facilities meeting tomorrow, and definitely at the board meeting on Tuesday. So, so when we get to that, you know, hopefully we have time today, but if we don't, we'll have other opportunities in the next couple of days to go through it.
Fair enough.
Any other questions on Assert? Okay, let's move to page 3, SPED and PPS, and I guess the question, there was a couple of, I guess the question is around, and without getting into detail about ongoing ongoing cases, and I think we'll be able to do that a little bit more in an executive session on Tuesday ahead of our monthly board meeting. But I guess the question was around kind of how we arrived, you know, to the extent that we can speak publicly about this, how we arrived at the numbers for out-of-district tuition settlements and then SPED transportation.
Sure. I can speak to that, and
Yeah.
I'd say it is a very highly individualized process, meaning when I think about each of those lines, I am thinking about specific student needs. Many of the items in both of those lines, and when I say both, I'm talking about tuition through agreement and out-of-district placements. That is based on, for the most part, known needs, meaning a student could be currently in a placement, and we know that we need to continue to provide that support, or we are anticipating that we are going to need to continue to provide that support in the following school year. There are definitely occasions where students are returning to district mid-year or at the beginning of the year, and other occasions where the opposite is happening, where students are transitioning to a different placement based on needs that are evolving for them. Those numbers do also include anticipated need. So maybe we are having some preliminary conversations with a family and a school team about supports and services that might be needed for a particular student. These lines this year, for the first time since I've been here, but I think for the first time in a while, do not represent any sort of contingency amount, meaning I didn't put in either one of those lines, well, we just might have 3 placements that we don't know anything about at this moment in time. So that's a shift for us. So that's what the process looks like. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, the contingencies were always a big issue, whether you build in contingencies or you go back to the Board of Finance for a special appropriation for those, for amounts over and above that, what you plan for. I think that it's important to note here, and especially as we get to the Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance, that there are no contingencies built in.
And I think it's equally important to remember that there are many factors that could lead to changes in placement. It's not just a change in student need. We could have a student move into district tomorrow, and the amount in one of those lines could look different as a result of that. The opposite, we could have a student move out of district tomorrow, and that could have an impact on those lines. These lines are particularly challenging because they are around individual student need, which I think I've explained previously.
Now, the COVID impact, I mean, you're seeing, when you look at the number of students, it's inched up in 2021, 21, 22, 22, 23. Is that just coincidental, or how do you see the impact of COVID affecting some of the more critical needs?
I think there's three impacting factors. One is just that sort of natural transition that happens, students moving in or out, or student needs changing over time, that I can't necessarily pinpoint to the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Another big part of this is, you might remember last year, the requirements in Connecticut changed in terms of our obligation for providing special education services. So previously, and when I say we, I mean every district in the state of Connecticut, not just Weston, were responsible for providing special education services from age 3 to age 21. Now we are responsible for providing special education services from age 3 to age 22. And the age out criteria, like when the student exits the district, is a little bit different, but I don't think I need to explain that within the context of this meeting. That means for the students who are eligible for services up until that age, we have another additional year to plan for that we hadn't had in previous budget cycles. The budget that we are living in this moment is the first time that we ever had to take that into account. And one of the things that I'll say that is specific to Weston is we do not have our own post-secondary program in district. Sometimes we provide post-secondary services, meaning services after 18, 19 to students within district, because that makes sense for them. And other times we're looking at placements that aren't in our district because we want them to get exposure to a different kind of program that will provide more enhanced opportunities to be planning for life beyond public education. Mm-hmm. That is something that in the longer term, in fact, I had talked about it in last year's budget as a goal for this year, and just realistically, that's not happening right now. I do think we need to think about that population, and we are small, so I'm not suggesting that would necessarily mean our own program, but are there ways to partner with other districts that do have their own program to think about how we can keep some of those students closer to us and their home community? And then the third piece is COVID. We have talked in every meeting, I think we've had this entire school year, about the increased mental health needs for our students, particularly at the middle school and high school. We have had a number of students who are in crisis. And we work with families, we work with outside agencies when that's appropriate. We obviously work as a school team to do everything that we can to support those students and to help them work through those challenges. And there are moments where the supports and services that are needed go beyond what we can provide in a public school. So those to me are the three factors impacting that line, or those lines.
Any questions on that? Transportation, Phil?
Sure. I think a lot of what we have for out of district transportation and the various within to the cost ties a lot into what Tracy just mentioned, right? Our current budget is based on, we do anticipate, based on what we know right now, we're planning for 10 runs. If that need should shift for any various reasons, that number could increase. I think there was one particular question as to how comfortable we feel or confident we are about our projection. Our projection really is based on what we know today. If there's any shift, whether up or down, we'll make the adjustments. But based on what we know, we're fairly confident in these numbers.
Okay, there's actually questions there's a couple of questions on, page 4. One is before we get, 11 and 12 are really not related to SPED and PPS, but there's a questions about homebound tutors, measuring the progress and alternative pathways, and a decrease for bus aids. Maybe we can hit on those.
Yeah, we can talk about homebound and bus aids together. Those changes are really directly related to trends over time and what we've seen in terms of actual expenditures over the last several years. It's not like we're making a cut there and anticipating that we're going to fall short. Based on what we've seen, we think those amounts are reasonable for the next projected budget.
All right. Progress on alternative pathways, how are we measuring that?
Yeah, many different data points is the short
Right.
answer to that question, but I did list several here. These are the primary data points, that we're using for students. We are definitely looking at grades in all classes. We are looking at attendance in counseling within the Pathways program. We're looking at attendance in academic and elective classes. And then we're looking at engagement in the mental health supports that are allocated for those specific students. We're looking at all of this data on an individual level and also at a group level. What is the trend for this particular population of students? And then something else that will be very important as we get closer to the end of the year is how do those grades translate into credits earned for graduation? I think we've spoken in previous meetings about, one of the primary drivers for shifting to the alternative pathways model was the academic component to that program. And we have seen so far a tremendous amount of success within that. So I think we're quite frankly excited to be looking at credits earned at the end of the school year. And we are on track for a very significant shift in that data when compared to previous years.
Mhm.
And that's why, quite frankly, we have increased the request for the academic component of pathways. Julie, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
Sure. I mean, I'll just say, echo what Tracy said. I mean, we're just coming up now on mid-year. So at the end of the semester, which will pretty much coincide with the end of January, we will have, some much more solid data points. But just in looking at things on an individual and a whole group level, even where they are right now, there is marked improvement for these students in all of those areas. And that is just so tremendously exciting to us. And yes, we want to look at how we can continue to serve these students and possibly additional students in the best possible way. And that academic piece is really critical. And then I think just in terms of data, sometimes it's easy to overlook anecdotal kind of data. Attendance and grades and things that are numbers are very easy to show charts and graphs and things. But I get on a routine basis texts and photos and videos of kids who are highly engaged in their learning, who have developed real deep, lasting relationships with the personnel that are part of this program. And that is not necessarily something that can be quantified, but is really remarkable.
And if I could add, we're talking about academics, as Julie said, and credits, but Tracy, perhaps you can talk a little bit about the background of the person that we were so, quite frankly, blessed to find that came to us to oversee this program.
Yeah, we hit the jackpot for sure. We were lucky enough to find someone who has extensive experience working in intensive outpatient or partial hospital programs through Yale New Haven. She She has so much training and expertise in areas like DBT. She understands the most complex needs, and her work in that role, interestingly, while it was not a school role, she was frequently on the other side of the communication with the school team. And so she came in with an understanding of, this is the type of information that we need. This is the best way to problem solve. These are some of the strategies that we can use, because previously she was the person kind of making that recommendation to the school team. And, you know, we are very focused on the academic component. You'll notice here, though, that one of the things listed as an evidence indicator is engagement in counseling. And not only were many of these students reluctant to engage academically, they were also very reluctant to engage in therapeutic support, including at the beginning of this school year. And so when Julie talks about anecdotal information, I mean, there are students in that program who have said to the social worker, sort of, I know I was really difficult at the beginning of the year, and I really didn't want to work with you, but now I know I need your help, and I know I can be successful with this kind of support. So those are the kinds of things that we're hearing from students, which I just think is really powerful. She's made wonderful connections to the students in that program. And I cannot leave out the SILs and the academic teachers who have created a vision for a program that they, unlike our social worker, they didn't really have the background of what this needed to look like. And they jumped in with both feet and have really helped to take it to a level that I don't even think I could have envisioned last year. So between our social worker, the paraeducator who is dedicated to that program, and the SILs, they just have done an outstanding job. I think the program honestly could be a model for other districts to be looking at.
Yes.
And that,
Go ahead.
sorry, Lisa, and just to circle back, that the consultancy piece that Tracy was talking about earlier, it is also key with this being a new program, with it being homegrown. That has been a tremendous resource for this grouping of staff members to be able to have really someone who is so knowledgeable and has so many suggestions for us and is willing to think through really unusual and new and different kinds of ideas. That consultancy has been tremendous for this program.
So stay tuned also, because the person that we're talking about is going to be a guest on What's Up in the Weston Public Schools future podcast.
Great. I have, before we get off this topic, I have a question, just, you know, Julie, Tracy, and Lisa, which is, do we have the resources we need, especially at the high school, to deal with some of the social emotional issues that we're seeing emerging post-COVID as we re-enter, just broadly speaking, right? Because this is the time to make sure we make sure that we have the resources we need.
You know, we've had a lot of discussion. We are continuing to have discussions up to this week about, do we have the right balance? Should we be asking for more? We were talking again, as I said, this week, this morning, and everything else. And it's something that we I think continually have to monitor. I guess I would say, you know, somebody like, well, why don't you ask for another social worker? Well, why don't you ask for another psychologist? Or maybe we need this person. And I'd like to take this opportunity just to very briefly have Tracy talk about specifically, not the alternative pathways, but the role of both the psychologist and the social worker. Because if we are thinking of perhaps making another tweak, I think it might be a good foundation for just the general public to know, like, what does it look like in the daily life of these people in the school?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. And it's a little bit of a complicated question because it does look different at each of the levels. So bear with me as I kind of speak in generalizations. The psychologist has very specific training and expertise. One of the biggest aspects of their role, and it's not always their favorite, but is the evaluation of students. That is an extremely time-intensive, extensive process that happens across all 4 buildings. They are tasked with evaluating students who are newly referred. They are tasked with evaluating students as part of a reevaluation, or just a need to gather additional information about a particular student at another moment in time. In so many ways, they are the backbone of that evaluation team, because they get a broad look at a student's functioning and performance, and most often all of the other pieces feed into that: the academic component, the related services, speech and language, OT and PT, all feed into that. And the psychologist really puts that whole puzzle together, or helps the team to put that whole puzzle together, in order to help determine what that student needs from a programming standpoint. And that is a lot of the work. They go to a tremendous number of meetings, and they are working one-on-one with students and families within that process. They also provide direct work with students, either individually or in small group. Often, although again, I'm kind of speaking in generalizations, often that support is part of a student's IEP. They tend to focus their service time on our identified students within the district. Not always, but that's most frequent. That is separate and distinct from the role of a social worker. So a social worker, first of all, the social worker cannot conduct evaluations. So anytime we're talking about evaluating a student, we're always looking at our psychologist. A social worker's role, in my mind, is more broad, meaning that they are often playing a more prominent role in the intervention aspect of a program. They are absolutely still working with students who have identified special education needs. They are also working with students who maybe have a 504 plan, and they are also working with students who are receiving SRBI kinds of supports. They have a very different clinical background than a psychologist. And I'm not saying psychologists don't do this, but social workers look at the student as part of a family and a broader, like, community network in a different way than a psychologist does. So these social workers are generally the people who are assessing risk for a student. Maybe they're the people who are interfacing with community resources to help students get connected to supports and services beyond what our district can offer. And typically they are interacting as a result with many more students than the psychologist would be. So that's like a broad strokes how I would define differences between the two. Both are very important. They often collaborate with each other, but they look through challenges and student needs through a slightly different lens.
Yeah.
You're on mute, Lisa.
You're on mute.
Can you elaborate a little bit then just about the shift we're making at Hurlbut?
Yes. So right now we have 2 psychologists at Hurlbut. That is the only building in our district that has that model. WIS, in contrast, has a psychologist and a counselor. Those are the 2 mental health providers in that building. And a counselor is different yet from a social worker and a psychologist. But the reason that we are proposing that shift at Hess is I defined that psychologist role as more specific and focused than the social worker role. And I think that's been a missing element at Hess for the couple of years that we've been in this model of 2 psychologists, which is relatively new, meaning those 2 psychologists are focusing a lot of energy on individual student need, and it's limiting their, we have less capacity to be doing broader intervention within that population, which is a really critical place to be providing intervention because those are our youngest students. So when we think about a social worker, they bring some clinical expertise to the table, which I think is different from a counselor, for example. And they are also focused more fully on building-wide supports and interventions, and less driven by individual student need. That makes sense.
So if we look at the current staffing or the proposed staffing, and this is kind of to share some of our discussions and thoughts, and we're certainly up to looking at it again in more detail. There is a consideration we can consider, for example, and we were talking about that this week, having addition to a district school psychologist for the elementary schools and an additional district school psychologist for the secondary levels. Now, why would we choose a psychologist over a social worker is probably one of your questions, if we were to move in that way. And when we get further down to looking at the proposed cut and this and that, I think we could actually do that with it staying within that cut. But Tracy, could you elaborate, if we were to consider bringing in 2 district school psychologists, how that would interplay? Because then it would free up the building psychologists, correct?
Yes. So I spoke a little bit earlier about how time intensive evaluations are for our school psychologists. And it's very important for those evaluations to be comprehensive and thorough. Those are the evaluations that really help us get to the bottom of what's going on for a student, so that our supports and services are the most meaningful. So the reason when I think about a district-wide role or a role that stretches across buildings, if that person is a psychologist, that's the only role where they can be doing evaluations for us. That frees up our people at the building level, our psychologists at the building level, who would still need to do some evaluations, but they would be able to focus their time more than they are able to right now on actually working with students, providing support to staff in terms of strategies and interventions that can be used in classrooms. It frees up their time to be doing more direct work. And honestly, if you have a skilled psychologist, they can evaluate at any level. The evaluation is standardized, so it's not as much about building a relationship as the day-to-day work, which is all about building a relationship and a rapport with a student. So to me, that seems like the most logical role.
Well, it gives a little bit more flexibility. And the other thing that I think we should note at is, so at the secondary level, and I'm thinking specifically through my high school hat, in the past, I'm talking pre-COVID, our counselors, our psychologists, and our social worker also ran counseling groups during the year. Like I know Stacy Slater, our psychologist, had specific groups, and these groups could range from, they would call them sophomore boys group, or children who suffered a loss, or senior girls, not to be so categorical, but groups of kids that shared the same perhaps profile, and that would want to meet in kind of a group setting. And that was run by counselors, it was run by the social worker, it was run by the psychologist. So in thinking also of the psychologist, to sort of hedge your bets, to have a psychologist that can test and can also spend more time doing that, that might be something that we should consider. I know this year, because of COVID, there has been a great strain on the school counseling department, and now I'm talking specifically at the high school. When you consider that if a teacher is out, a teacher can leave lesson plans, one of our CILs, or a building para, a building sub, like Eric Peterson, our trainer, or a volunteer like Tom Glass, who's in the sub pool, can go in and can pretty much keep the learning going with whatever work there is. And some of them are really geared to specific disciplines. When a counselor, a social worker is out, a psychologist is out, the work pretty much stops. And just to give you a frame of reference, over the course of the last 70 so days, 80 days we've been in school, okay, they have been out for obviously like the general population of our staff for a variety of reasons, including, sick, personal, family illness, whatever the reason, COVID, unfortunately, quarantining, that puts a strain on the overall system. So we're trying to keep that in mind. And at the same time, we don't know moving forward to the next budget cycle. We put in the one position, but we may want to consider putting in the second school district psychologist to be able to free up those people more at the building level. The other thing to consider is, and Julie, I'm going to ask you to speak a little bit to this, is that one of the questions was, what potential functions can we share with the town of Weston? In our Durgay neighbors, there are other services that are provided that work in the schools but are actually paid for by the town budgets. And I know this was discussed with the Durgay principals the other day. Julie, if you can elaborate on that, please.
Sure. So I regret that I don't yet have all of the specific data on this, but anecdotally, many of our neighbors, high schools within Durgay, have additional positions on their counseling staff that are filled by contracted employees. Notably, a number of them have a kids in crisis counselor, and perhaps Tracy may know a little bit more about that and can elaborate, but a kids in crisis counselor as well as a drug and alcohol counselor. Those are positions that currently exist in other Durgay high schools and in multiple other high schools. That add value to that program, because as Lisa said, we have students that have varying needs. They have different kinds of profiles and that at times need different types of help. So that was just interesting for me to learn that information. And particularly what was interesting to me was that those positions, for the most part, as far as I'm aware at this point, are funded by the town. They're not part of the operating budget in those places. So I think what's challenging about the situation that we are in, and we have all acknowledged in so many ways, is that the situation with students' mental health right now is really dire. There are students who have significant needs. There are students who have needs who are struggling, and we are not even aware. They're not even on our radar because our students are good at hiding these things. And how this is going to come back to the conversation we've been having. How we allocate our staff to work with those students is really going to become critical. But at the same time, it's a community issue. It's not just a school issue. So how can we as a community come together and look at resources that we can come together on?
Okay.
So I don't know that I don't have the answers. I am not asking for a drug and alcohol counselor or a kids in crisis counselor. I do think that there is more of a need for a community conversation about how we support students' mental health, because yes, there is a responsibility on the part of the schools. But as we're illustrating, it has become very challenging given the staffing that we have.
Now, I realize this is a very complex, challenging issue, but let me pull it back here to the budget, okay?
Sure.
Which is kind of what are we saying here? So, do we? Are you saying the budget number is right, except we need to refigure out how to allocate differently depending on how we see our needs evolve? Or do we not have the resourcing right and we need to rethink that?
What I would say right now, my gut is this, and just an aside, we used to have a kids in counselor kids in crisis. Dan Doak remembers, remember? Dan, we had it at the high school, and then we wanted an in-house. So It might be interesting to look at. The bottom line is this, okay? We could benefit from having another psychologist at the district level that would then free up at the secondary level and having that. And, as I said, we put together the budget. We have been in constant conversation, looking at different things over this up until this morning. So we put that in. Then it's also tied, though, to that $350,000 cut list, if you will, which gets to the really, right down to the classroom and the social emotional. In looking at that list, I could refigure it and make it work so we could put that position in.
Okay.
And I think
So-
that we need to have some more discussion on it, but yes.
Okay, so let's, I think that's a list we should probably get to today.
Sure.
So let's do the following. I think that we should, I think we should go through legal, the capital budget, and then go through, one of the things that is always a big part of the budget is stressing the budget. Is okay, if you were forced to cut X amount of dollars as an administration, what are those things that you would actually cut, and what would be the impact? So I think that's an important part of the budget process. So I think we should get to that today. My view is, let's go through the breakdown of legal expenses. Let's go through the capital budget, and then let's go through kind of what the cut list would look like and what the impact would be.
That's fine.
Okay. There was a question where, and I think it's a really critical thing to do, which is let's go through our non-sped. I think we'll touch upon pending litigations in our executive session in special ed. But let's go through kind of a more detailed list of how we're spending our non-sped legal expenses. Right, Phil, do you want to, or Lisa?
Phil.
Sure. So as I mentioned at our last meeting, it's a little difficult to determine, for example, what buckets our district-wide expenditure, non-sped legal fees, how that will be allocated. Because in any given year, those expenditures, it varies, right? Because the need will shift from year over year. Instead of trying to put money into different categories, what we have done instead is that we've given just an historical perspective. We've given an analysis in the appendix as to how the money legal fees has been spent over the past several years, just so that the board can get a better understanding or a better feel as to the potential of where the money could potentially go. I would just want to point out that for this current fiscal year, you will notice that as it relates to FOIA-related expenditures, we have spent pretty much close to, this is through November. And through November, we have spent almost as much as we spent for the entire fiscal year last year. And we have no idea in what direction that may go for the remainder of the year. Now, based on the discussion that we have on Friday, we are definitely mindful of the need, to not just reach out to the attorney just for the sake of reaching out to the attorney, but there are really specific instances where the need of that attorney is needed to get us to really provide us with their level of expertise. But in terms of Lisa had mentioned, right? So we have a new administration or a new leader, and that leader has taken as their priority to really be on top of sending out requests and get on top of the requests as soon as we get them. Not saying that we were not doing them, but we have just seen a sheer increase in the volume of the requests that we're getting from the taxpayer. So again, so I can't identify how the money will be spent for legal expenses, but I can definitely give you just that historical perspective.
Yeah. So you have a chart, right?
There is a chart. Don't have a page number, but in the appendix, page 26, it looks like, in the appendix, there is a chart there. And I'm sorry for the glaring error here, that we should have taken that out because we don't have any expenses as it relates to our deductible for insurance.
Okay.
It's entitled General Legal Fees Summary, and it goes from 2019 to 2022. The other thing that you need to, one thing to mention is when you look at some of these specific cases, and for example, I'll look at for you. Yes, this is the legal fee, but there is also, when you think about the time that administrators and director of technology and people are spending on the different requests. For example, I can tell you that yesterday, Dan DeVito spent, how long was it, Dan? 5 hours working on a particular request that involved 19,000 emails that then have to be redacted by a support person. There is, and these are, people have the right for this information, but just to kind of quantify that, that's time that he's not spending on instructional technology or the infrastructure. I don't know if you want to add anything, Dan, because you have been very involved in, because a lot of these requests are electronic.
Sure. So when you're doing a request and you've got to pull the emails out of the archiver and you've got to convert them in order to be redacted and pared down, sometimes the sheer quantity of emails as part of the request make it very, very difficult for me to convert anything, and everything starts crashing. So then everything has to get pieced out. So let's say, we had 19,000 emails. So then I have to do it at like 800 emails at a time. And each chunk takes over an hour to do. So it's depending on the request, it can become an extremely time-consuming process. And that's only one part of the process, because then the next part of the process is redacting and paring down the emails, which takes even longer than what I have to do.
Can I ask a question? Because obviously this is an area I have experience in, because we have to provide these types of services to our clients. Could we, as a district, invest in, I know that you archive our email because we're a public institution, but are you using third-party tools like a global relay who can do the, you can essentially take the search requests and define them a lot better. There's a cost associated with it, but then potentially we're not using a Dan DeVito, we're potentially using somebody who is better suited for the request.
No, right now we're just from a discovery perspective, we're using Google Vault, which is a built-in archiver with Google, and then a multitude of programs to get everything converted to a PST and then to PDFs. So we are not using any third-party company or product for this stuff.
One thing, I'm sorry. I was just going to add, and it's not about the technical, you guys know that much better than I do, but we do try to narrow the request. So I can give you an example. There was a request for every email that the former superintendent sent in, I don't know, it was a year's time or whatnot. And we said, could you narrow it down for us? No. So, then we're like, okay, we can't narrow it down. Could you like on subject or, and sometimes, the searches do get tricky if we don't search for the right term. I know something like that happened prior to my arrival, that a term was, it wasn't done exactly perhaps the way that we should have done it. So there's so many multi-layers to this. That it just makes it challenging. I don't know how that would relate to any service that we could get to help us. I do know that in many cases, and these are multiple people requesting these things, they may be able to narrow down the scope, or they might not, because they want to see everything, which becomes equally as challenging.
Yeah, I'm just curious if we can make an investment in software, which may have a one-time upfront cost, but then we can better align the resource who's doing the search. Because as you said, taking Dan away from educational technology time to do searches is counterintuitive to really our mission, which is to try and spend every dollar we have educating our kids. So I don't know if we can look into that, Dan, or if you haven't, it's just not possible.
We have. I've met with vendors before to find a better streamlined solution, but there is a cost, and it is a high cost in order to do that. So that's something that would have to be budgeted, and we'd have to make sure it was in there, for the long term. So, You know, I have looked into that before. I've used products previously that would make the process a little bit easier. But again, it's all about us and making sure we invest the money to get it to work properly.
It's also something we should look into, making sure that we pool our resources with the town as well, because I know the town is facing very, very similar issues.
Yeah,
What happened?
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I spoke to Sam Nestor yesterday about it after our community safety meeting. Where is this an area where we can, right now they have support that they use, but they face the same dilemma. I do think that ours is at a higher magnitude when we're talking about 80,000, 20,000 emails.
Yeah.
Tony, what happened? I recall attending, I think it was a Board of Selectmen meeting. I don't think it was a Board of Ed meeting, where the town or somebody asked for about $10,000, which seems super reasonable. And I think the person that they were going to hire to do this actually was a Weston employee, may have moved out of town, and the person could do the work remotely. Did that ever come to fruition? Is that person?
I don't know.
Yes, I believe that they said yes at our meetings, what I remember. However, what I also remember is that piece did not, it still involved a significant amount of manpower at the town level. It supplemented it.
And I will also add, David, you bring up a good point, the amount of work, the technology to help streamline it, but there is still, with FOIA and FERPA requests, the human element, which is the most critical piece, is you have to read through every single email and every single email attachment and every document and everything that's been requested to ensure that student data is protected, student privacy is enforced. Anything for HIPAA or anything staff related, you've got to be very careful with all that. So there is no technology that can pare down, okay, this email is attorney-client privilege. This email has student data. We've got to redact these 6 names from it. So there's always going to be a major human element to all of these types of requests.
Yeah, no, I know when we get those requests from our clients, and typically from an attorney, we ask that they say things like this word within X number of words of this word, right? So they pare down the request. But what it sounds like Lisa is saying is that the ability to pare down the request is denied, right? We want every email. It's not that we want every email that has the word budget within 6 words of SPED, just as an example. We want every email. Okay.
Right.
And that doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes people say, yeah, narrow it down. But in the one, for example, that I'm thinking of, the former superintendent, no paring down every email.
So there's really no way to automate it to bring the costs down. And we are, to wrap it back to the budget and legal, we are trying to utilize in-house resources to fulfill the request. And unfortunately, at the moment, it falls on Dan.
Just out of curiosity, the technical part aside, the manpower to redact all these emails and go through, which is just sounds painful, to be perfectly honest with you. So Lisa, you spoke with Sam about the possibility of a shared resource on that, or sharing the existing resources?
What we had a very preliminary discussion, basically commiserating of the challenge. and
Okay.
she shared that they are facing a similar challenge.
So one of the comments that you had in one of the questions here, you'd said somebody asked if there's any possibility we could get, town volunteers or something to help, and you said no, it has to be a union job, which is understandable. But if we do a shared resource, well, I mean, it is what it is. If we do a shared resource between the school district and the town, does that have to be a union employee? Does that fall under that umbrella, or how would we handle that?
I would say it depends on the position and the response about, like, there was some people there was a thread, I forget specifically in the questions, where people said, could we get some volunteers in to help, like, library aides, things like that. We can't, because they're union positions. That's very tricky.
Right.
And with the town also has a union. So I think it depends on the position. We have support staff here at central office. For example, my administrative assistant that is that is not a union position. The town does have, if they're using under consultancy. I mean, I think it can be worked out if we want to go that route.
Well, it sounds as if, I mean, if, like you're saying, Dan used 5 hours of his day the other day just to get the technical side of it done. And the more labor intensive side is being done by various administrative folks within the district. Putting a value on their time is actually really important for us to understand.
Yeah.
So I think it would be, if there's any way we could get that number to find out what the value of their time spent on FOIA requests is, then maybe we could use that to make a case either within the state or to the state or with the town to get some help. Because, I understand, look, the budget is, we're trying to keep the budget within reason. And our reason is educating our children. And these FOIA requests take away from that. And so I'm trying to see if there's any way that the school doesn't have to shoulder the financial burden that is associated with these FOIA requests, and see if there's any way that we can turn it back to, the state or the town or something to get some sort of financial relief from what we're experiencing.
Never forget the state. I think it's a matter of working with our partners in town to, it's not just on legal matters like this, but it's on every way we can find synergies, right?
Sure.
But this is certainly one of them. This is kind of this one is really should be low hanging fruit to work together with the town to figure out how to more efficiently, handle these, because this is here to stay. This is something that all towns are facing. We're facing it, and we need to do it in the most economical manner while making sure we meet our legal obligations, under FOIA.
Sure. I mean, just having someone, a professional redactor, quite frankly, between the town and the district would be huge. Because when the support staff, when Jody sits there and has to spend 10 hours a week redacting, then I'm doing clerical work, to be very blunt. I'm doing the work that she can't do for me.
So I have a couple of questions. Phil, you have 150,000 as your, sorry. I have 150,000 as the as your, you put that as your budgeted amount. You're probably going to be, we have union negotiations this year. We have a whole bunch of things happening. You're going to be pretty tight on that line, I think.
We could, but Tony, so it's so I did ask myself that question, right? Like, do I increase it? And given just the uncertainties and just in terms of the various needs, and also again, always with an eye and just trying to be as fiscally responsible as possible, do we raise it, or do we kind of leave it out there as it is and take a risk? I mean, there is some exposure. There is some exposure just in our general budget. Do I think that will be significantly over? Maybe, maybe not. It all depends on how things are trending, right? And it varies. So fingers crossed. I mean, if the board is willing to give a slight increase in this category, I would definitely accept it. But again, it's every year that we do our budget, we try to keep our costs that's not directly related to the students at a minimum, right? We try not to increase those costs and try to live within our budget and try to really keep the focus within the classrooms, because that is our primary focus.
Yeah, I think, when you get to the end of this, I'm sure there's going to be some give and takes, right? So I just keep that in mind.
Definitely will.
Any questions on the legal lines? We have about an hour and a half. My recommendation is to hit the capital, two important items, the capital budget, and then talk a little bit about, if we were to stress the budget where the administration thinks there could be room and what the impact would be. So who wants to go through the revised capital budget and a little bit on what the thinking was on the revision?
I can take a quick stab at that. So at our last meeting and prior to that, also at our facilities and finance and operation meeting, we did have quick discussions in terms of the middle school and primarily an item that was originally on, which was a duct cleaning. So we did put a placeholder for the duct cleaner. We did increase that slightly. I think the number were a slight error here. That should be more like 245,000. So we do plan on doing some duct work there. It's going to be a little more detailed work that needs to be done as it relates to, finding the prints and seeing exactly what it is. I do want to point out that all of the items that we have here, we probably will need to issue an RFP to determine what the final cost will be. So these, for the most part, there's some of these numbers that are pretty solid, and some of these numbers that sort of kind of on the soft side.
Mm-hmm.
What we also did, so we went back to last year and we kind of we went back to 2 years and we took a look at those items that we took off. One quick second. So what we added for this year, we focused primarily on the mechanical items, right? So we added some pumps. We're thinking that a price range for that may be about 75,000. We're kind of trying to shore up those numbers. We should have some numbers to discuss tomorrow. So a lot of the primary items that we added here really were for mechanical. We did have a discussion last year as it relates to the mechanical, right? That although these are original to the building, they're still operating, right? And it's very difficult for us just to identify or just to go ahead and blank and just broadly just replace all of those items. So we're trying to be a little bit strategic. Last year, we did ask the Board of Finance just to give us somewhat of a contingency, just in case we should have a failure of any one of our units. Our original request was for 100,000. The board decided to pare that back to Board of Finance, and our contingency for this general mechanical repairs is $25,000. Now, not knowing what direction the FOC is going to lean, what we're thinking also for this year is to request to increase that contingency from 25,000 and try to get maybe as close to 100 as possible. Again, just because we just don't know where the failure will occur. Another item that we added was a replacement of some sinks in the art room. Those sinks that we have in there are original to the building. So our plan is to replace, I think there are 4 of those sinks that's there. That's going to be about $24,000. Also, we're also thinking of adding lockers for the 7th and 8th grade to replace the lockers for the 7th and 8th grades. So these are really in terms for the middle school, right? Because that's where we were. These are the items that we think were of a priority right now. We definitely over the next 2 weeks, we can sort of kind of refine those.
So tell me this. I mean, are there no health and safety related things that you need to do in the middle school that would be a priority over lockers?
Well, no, I think the health and safety issue really relates to the pumps and to the overall HVAC.
Right.
And that's the big ticket item that's item 15 on the revised list as a TPD.
Right.
So
Okay.
those are really the items that relate to the health and safety.
And the cleaning of the
cleaning up the
ducts.
ducts. Correct. So those are the main health and safety items that we have.
Right. Tell me, I mean, I don't know, as long as I've been on the board, we've been talking about locker replacements.
Yeah.
Dan, it's never made it to the final list.
I go ahead, Dan. You're muted, Dan.
We did replace the 6th grade lockers, and that has
Right.
made a very big difference. And those went in just prior to COVID.
Right.
In terms of other revisions that we have made to the capital list, we have shifted the track replacement to year 24. And this is just to coincide with Parks and Recs and their sinking fund. So that replacement or that work is slated now for fiscal 23-24. Another shift that we've made is item 26. Well, no, that's a future year. So that for the current fiscal year, fiscal 22-23, those are the changes that we have made since the last time we met.
Mm-hmm. Now, there was a question. There was a question around whether track replacement. I don't know who asked that. It was a written question about what the requirements are around track replacement. Whether it's a kind of a statutory thing, or is there a regular cadence to replacing tracks, and which part of the tracks get replaced, or is this something that's very is this something that's subjective as to when you do it? How does that work, right? I don't know who asked that question.
Yeah, I think I'm going to defer this one. So I'm going to allow Mark to start on this one.
Good morning.
Hey there.
Yeah, so as far as how long a track lasts, that obviously depends on the subsurface, and there's a lot of factors that go into that. We have been repairing cracks in our track for many years, and the last time that we had a company here and had a conversation with them, with Parks and Rec, the town was involved as well. They recommended that we look at the subsurface, not at the surface, because we are band-aiding it over time, but never really dealing with the actual issue, which is underneath. The concrete is now cracked, so every time moisture comes up through that, it's going to crack what's above it. So it really needs to be dealt with from the ground up.
Right. And that could wait a year.
Yes, I think we will be fine waiting a year. We might have to do a little patchwork here or there, which we've done over the years. And our track doesn't look as good as it probably should, but we can make it usable for another year.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'm assuming that this list, we didn't go through this list with building committee yet, did we?
We have not had, we did go through just a preliminary list with the build, I think not with a full committee. Richard Wolf was present at our last meeting, our subcommittee meeting, but we have not presented this full list to the building committee. I think if I should guess, that Richard was, for the most part, supportive of the items that we have listed. I don't want to speak for Richard, but he did not. I don't recall that he did bring up any major objection to our preliminary list.
Mm-hmm.
But Richard did point out a few weeks ago, as it relates to, one second there, to item 4, which is adding the double door at the west, which is more for security concern. He did point out that in terms similar to what we've seen just with the disruption to the overall supply chain, that he's thinking that this particular door, or whatever work that may need to this, that the part is maybe we're maybe looking at 6 to 8 weeks out. So he did kind of caution us that if we do decide in doing this, that we probably need to secure the contractor on this, and ultimately to secure the services. I did mention to Richard that it was important for us that we do approve it, and as a general rule, we do not enter into contracts or enter into RFPs really until we have secured funding with the Board of Finance.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to just make just to mention, it's not on our current budget, but it wasn't our budget last year, but we kind of we did take it out, and this was a replacement of the new gym floor. We have noticed over the past several years some cracks and some lifting off the subfloor. We do believe that we have a workaround and we do have a solution for this. We have not been able to apply the solution that we have, but I'm only mentioning it because if we were to replace that entire gym floor, that is going to be another significant cost that we will have to add to the capital budget. So we're going to try the workaround that we have. We did have a flooring company that gave us a solution to it. So we will be applying that solution, and fingers crossed.
So we're at the Facilities and Finance Committee tomorrow. Richard Wolf will probably be there. So
Correct.
We'll go through this with him. Any questions or comments on the revised capital list? Yeah, I think we should make sure that we get all of the items that we think we need to get to this year. Because ultimately this list is going to be combined with the town list and reprioritized by Board of Finance, right? So, let's get everything we need on this list right now, because you kind of know how it works. I mean, there'll be a renewed discussion once we get to the Board of Finance and they see the entire capital list.
Yeah, we definitely when we did with Mike and Mike has joined us, just in terms of our overall needs. And I do believe that where we are on the list that we have presented really would our needs for this fiscal year. We have tried the best as we can just to outline and just to present what our future needs will be. Again, so we keep kind of pivoting a little bit as it relates to overall to the FOC and ultimately what direction that may head. But in terms of, as the board mentioned last week, we do need to maintain our facility the best that we can, and that has always been and will continue to be our goal.
Okay. There's no other questions. Do you want to take a 10-minute break, or do you want to go right up to 12 o'clock? It's up to everyone. You need a 10 minutes to get to things?
Could we please have a 10-minute break
Okay.
and let's keep it at 10 minutes?
Yeah, 11 sharp. Okay.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks. All right. Give everybody a minute. So I guess there's a couple of places that I think we need to go. One is there's a whole bunch of answers to questions on staffing that is several pages. And what I would say is that we should take a look at that on your own times and see if the questions have been sufficiently answered. And to the extent they haven't, maybe we can just allocate some time at the monthly meeting to continue that discussion and to bring up those questions that you still have that where you're not satisfied with the answers, or maybe the answers are incomplete or whatever. But one of the things that I think we should kind of use probably the remainder of the time is really looking at where the administration thinks that if they had to cut, where would some potential cuts come from? And I think this is around the discussion that we always have, which is, before we go to the taxpayers for additional dollars, to make sure that we're comfortable that we've created enough capacity internally for our needs by looking potentially at those things that we might be able to do without. This is always a difficult discussion with the board because when you look at some of those things, many of the board members say, yeah, sure, we can do without, but there's some of those things that, even if they're small items, that we kind of say, you know what, we probably can't do without them, or it doesn't make sense to remove them. So the exercise here really was for Lisa and the administration and staff to basically take a number, which is, 350,000, and say, okay, if you had to reduce by 350,000, where do you think you would go to do that? I think ultimately that's a question that the Board of Finance will ask. And also remember that we still have to have that discussion with the Board of Finance about dental and whether that's going to be run through the operating budget, or we'll completely kind of draw down on the internal services fund for that. But let's leave that discussion aside for a while. And maybe I could turn it over to Lisa to kind of maybe go through that list, which is, I guess, the last page of the attachments, and sort of get her view on where she thinks some of the cuts would be possible.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, I'm thinking.
Mhm.
So we were tasked with a list for 350,000, and also to look at what would it look like if it was 1%. 1% would be an additional 219. And so if you look at the list for the 350,000, there's a couple of things that I want to preface, especially for people that perhaps have not been looking at the budget for as many years as some of us have. In my presentation, I talk very specifically about the personalization and how that is expected in Weston, how, quite frankly, looking like a private school, it's that level of personalization, the connection with the staff. And let's face it, the overall, 77% is salary and benefits. So when you look at this list, there's a lot of little things up along the top that are not people. And then as you get down to towards the end of the list, you see that, yeah, there are people, education paras, math interventionists, things like that. And, I have to say, I get the exercise. I do think it's important to note that when we put this budget together, and I spent days, hours, minutes analyzing it from every angle. And when we're asked to say, well, okay, if you're forced to cut, what would you cut? That's a really hard exercise to do because of the level of attention that we've done. And I know you know this, but for me, I think it's important to articulate again, especially when you look at, you don't want to take from the classroom, but over the years, before I sat in this chair, we have taken from security, from support staff, secretaries, custodians, maintenance, grounds, everywhere. We're pretty much at the end here, guys. Like if we go much deeper, it's very concerning to me. So we did our best bet, that being said, with things like software, with things like instructional supplies, with things like, the coaches that we wanted to put in, despite them, the esports coach for being in existence 4 years, postponing that stipend. How can we do this in a way that doesn't affect the instructional core? And this is the list that we came up with. You look at office supplies and piecing all these pieces together. That doesn't really amount to a lot until you get to 26 and 27 on my spreadsheet, where you're talking about general ed paras at 130 and the math interventionist at 0.5. That's all, there's a consequence to doing that I know that the both elementary school principals can speak to, because those are people that work directly with children. But this is our best thinking at the 350. I'm just trying to be as transparent as possible. And when we started thinking about the 1%, just to kind of add a little bit of a flavor, really, if you're going to look at any other staffing, and I don't know how between all of the support staffing that we can cut it any closer, to be frank. We cut security guards already. We now have, the security, for example, one person's out and somebody else has to leave their post and rotate between all the buildings. I don't know how we would do that. We have it with the support staff and the guidance PPS. We lost 2 secretaries over the years in that. And so right now, you had MJ, the main office secretary at the middle school, manning a job that used to be done by 3 people for about 6 weeks this year, Mr. Doak. So I'd be hard pressed to put anything out that. And I don't want to say it's going to end up at the instructional core, but looking at this list, I think that we could be okay with this list. Go much deeper. And quite frankly, you might have to start looking at your Board of Ed class size guidelines. And I did an exercise in it to sort of bring it to life. If you altered the class size guidelines, and I would not recommend this, to kindergarten and first grade up to 22 and second through fifth up to 26. Yeah, that would be 5 teachers at a cost of $500,000. But at what expense? At what expense? That's why people move to this community. That's why when Laura Kata sits down with preschool families that haven't even bought a house here, they want to know class size. So we have tried the best we can to mitigate this. If we look to put back the other psychologist in, which is what we talked about it, I can only get to about 306,000. And I know we have to talk about the dental. I think that people think like, okay, with transportation, maybe we could save money there, or with health benefits, maybe we can save money there. Maybe we can. I hope we can, moving forward, looking at the contractual obligations. But I've been sitting in the seat since July, and I'm very conscious of every dollar and how we spend it. If we put back that other position, that if we add a position rather of another district psychologist and mitigate the cost between that and the aides and things like that, I still can only cut, we're down to about 280. So this is kind of where we're at, and it is what it is.
Well,
I don't know where else we can go.
Well, go to the bottom of the list. And
sure.
And the last 2 things are really the only staffing you have really is the last 2 items, right?
Right.
The staffing. Tell a little bit about the impact of what doesn't get done if you don't
Sure.
have those 2. Yeah.
Okay, and I will start, and then I would ask Ms. Kadis and Ms. Fauber, who were
Mhm.
upset that it was put on, to be perfectly frank, because they see on a daily basis what happens.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Listen, this is, you know, this
Painful.
happens
I know.
we go through this every year, but you know,
We have
this
to.
is, this is what we have to really go through. This is not
Mhm.
because, you know, we want to have difficult discussions just for the sake of having difficult discussions. I think this is absolutely necessary.
No, and I understand that, and I don't mean to,
Yeah.
we get that. So when you look at the general ed para, what we did was we wrote position to be determined by building administration. So there are basically 3 instructional paras that are in each of these buildings. That's not sped paras. That's not necessarily like the preschool and kindergarten. These are 3 instructional paras. You have a math para, you have a language arts para, you also have a library para. And so I think it's important that, you know, it would be up to them how they would configure that particular cut. In the lives of an instructional para, let's say it's a 7.5 hour day, and a half hour they have to eat lunch. Now we're down to 7 hours. They also spend time, just so you know, in monitoring recess in the cafeteria. So how much time actually in classrooms? About 5 hours? Give or take 5.5 hours. The other thing is that they are used to backfill when a teacher is pulled to, for example, go to a special ed PPT meeting and we need coverage. That's who we use. So I'm going to stop there and let the 2 administrators who are directly affected by this speak. The only thing I would add is if you look, well, maybe it's the library para. I've been in that library when Sharon Rodko is constantly teaching. I don't know how that would even translate at Hurlbut to do the library para, but those are just my observations. Laura, Patty?
I can start. Losing an instructional para would directly impact the students. You know, we have 22 classrooms in K-2, and having our instructional para go into the classrooms and support those students has a tremendous impact on their learning and growth. At the early elementary years, we're trying to lay very strong foundational skills and strategies and habits of learning that will then enable our students to be successful as they continue right up through the high school. Particularly at the youngest ages, our students do need a high level of supervision and support. They're not yet independent learners. It's one of our goals, and it's something we build towards as students enter school system for the very first time. The instructional paras also support our departments, math, reading, and science. And by having those positions, our curriculum instructional leaders are able to spend the vast majority of their time working directly with teachers. If I think about one of our curriculum instructional leaders who's responsible for literacy and social studies, within that and supporting 22 teachers, she supports reading, writing, foundations, which is our word work spelling program, and social studies. Those are several content areas times 22 teachers. So for her to be able to spend the vast majority of her time working directly with those teachers, you know, we need the support of, you know, the materials and some of those small clerical pieces that are very much a part of our program. We have a wide variety of reading materials for our students, need to be organized. We need, you know, it's our fiscal responsibility to make sure that they're organized, they're accounted for, they're inventoried, to make sure that we are staying on top of the very generous materials that were provided by this community. It also allows our intervention teachers to spend all of their time working directly on the interventions with teachers, because then our para educators can support our classrooms in other ways. In addition, as Lisa mentioned, they also support our lunch and recess, and also our arrival and dismissal procedures. When you're working with 4-year-olds to 7-year-olds, they require a high level of supervision. Safety is paramount for us at the early elementary years. When our instructional day ends, or when students are moving between lunch, recess, breaks, you know, it's very different at the early elementary years. We don't just say, you know, class is over, see you tomorrow, which can happen a little easier at the upper levels. those students need to be constantly monitored and supervised throughout the day. So those instructional assistants are a very important piece of our program, and the loss would directly impact students.
So I'm not sure much more what I can say. Laura sort of summed up a lot of losing an instructional para-educator. I mean, while our students are a little bit older than they are at Hurlbut, they also need lots of supervision, support, reading. We're going from that learning to read to reading to learn phase, but also in math. I mean, they're building those strong content-based skills that they're going to need when they get into the middle school. For us, the other cut for us is a 0.5.
Okay,
math.
can we hold off on that defer piece? I'm sorry.
Okay. So, yeah, I'll hold on.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. You might say, well, then why did you put it on the list? That would be the natural question. And then I think it kind of segues into what Patty's talking about. We put it on the list, quite frankly, because we're using the Assert funds to provide interventionist teachers that do the push-in model. So part of the thinking is, and it's a two-edged sword, if you will, because we have increased the teaching FTE in those areas, primarily in math and reading. But again, it's only carries through till next year. That's why we put those two on the list. Now, that being said, we also put on the list a slight reduction of the math interventionist at the intermediate school. Patty?
Hold on, Lisa, just to be clear on what you said.
Yes.
Is this, so are these two, these 1.5 FTEs currently being paid for by Assert?
No.
Okay.
What I'm saying is we had two in the operating budget. And when we were trying to look, and again, it comes down to, you can nickel and dime this. You're not going to get to this kind of a cut unless you put staff on there.
Right.
And so we were looking to see, and so it was my idea. I mean, I take responsibility for it. I said, if we are having this certain level of intervention with certified teachers, can we for next year then take this hit, if you will? Right. Knowing that we have added more intervention in those two areas.
Got it.
And so of course, and the principals are speaking from the heart for their own buildings, but that's sort of my mindset behind that.
Yeah.
Patty, I don't know if you want to elaborate on the math intervention piece.
Yep. So historically, we've always had about a 0.7 math intervention in our building. Interventionist piece, in addition to the CIL piece, in addition to our math para educator. This year, because of the Assert grant, we were able to increase that to a 1.5, which is, obviously we're using every minute of that time. So next year, we're hoping with all the work that we're doing this year, also with the added time of Carolyn Vinton, because of the new structure of the CIL down at Hurlbut, we're hoping that reducing that by a 0.5, still giving us a 1.0 full-time interventionist, and still having some paraprofessional for math, and still having Carolyn Vinton with us. We're hoping that will be sufficient for us for our math support for next year.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
So basically for next year, there's a little bit more math intervention at WIS than we normally had prior. And with, as Patty said, Carolyn is in that building full-time, so it'd be one full-time interventionist and Carolyn in there.
Yeah, we usually, there have been times we went through the nitty-gritties of the impact of every $1,000 cut, but I think that's a little bit counterproductive. I don't know if we want to get into that kind of detail, but does anybody have questions about the impact of anything on this list?
One thing I want to add is that Dan DeVito can speak up. By not starting the lease purchases for this technology, we're kind of just kicking the can down the road. I look at it and I think specifically about the kindergarten iPads. I mean, yes, can they wait? Yes, but there's applications and things they won't be able to do. And Dan, perhaps you can speak a little bit about the leasing component of that, because I was like, well, maybe we can find somebody to fund the 10,000, but it's really not that simple. Dan?
Sure. So we started this last year. We put together a 6-year technology replacement plan. And that's actually on page 244 in your books. This year we updated it to include some infrastructure that I didn't realize was as aged as it currently is. So all of the stuff that we have listed on the technology plan is replacement of existing equipment that is aging out. None of these are new initiatives. So what we put on the list are the replacement of the kindergarten iPads. The current kindergarten iPads are no longer supported by Apple, meaning they don't put out iOS updates. And as apps update their own versions, we increase the chance of the apps no longer being supported by the operating system that's on those iPads. We already have 2 that worked in the beginning of the year that no longer work on those iPads. And we have no way of truly knowing which apps will make it through the end of next year and which apps will not. The other is the replacement of the 62 iMacs at the high school that's used in like the digital arts courses. Those Macs are 8 years old. And every year, as Adobe updates their suite, they become more and more resource intensive and hungry. And those iMacs can barely hang on to using the products that they need to use almost on a daily basis. So we're looking to replace those iMacs. If you look on page 244, the first box, 2223, shows that we are looking to replace or spend around $315,470. We are looking to start a capital lease program. So it would be a 4-year lease with a $1 buyout at the end of the lease, and the equipment is ours. So it is not a lease like when you lease a car. You actually own the equipment. It's more like a payment plan. And what we would do is over the next 4 years, we would lease the equipment year over year. And as a 4-year lease would expire, we would redo a lease to buy new replacement equipment. So this builds in a replacement plan for all of the critical infrastructure and technology in the district. So at the bottom of that page, you will see for FY23, it will cost us around $88,272 in a lease payment to fund the purchase of the $315,000 in equipment. So when Lisa brought up, oh, you're saying we only need to cut we only need to find $10,000 for the iPads. That's incorrect. The actual cost of the purchase of the iPads is around $39,000, but you're dividing that around 4 by 4, and that's how much we are actually paying year over year for the equipment. So it's not like we could go to the PTO and say, hey, would you be able to fund $10,000? No, it's now asking them, would you be able to fund $38,000, which is simply too much to ask the PTO. So that's in a nutshell what we're looking to do with the technology leasing and the 6-year technology plan. One of the things I do want to bring up, what we do not include in the 6-year technology plan are replacements such as labs, because every year we kind of identify, is this lab still being used? Does it have a purpose? Is the equipment aging out? Yes, okay, then we need to look to replace it. But that is something that we always review the purpose of labs, because the concept of computer labs has evolved over the past 10 years. At one point, it was almost a mandatory thing, and now they're less and less useful. However, the digital arts labs are very much needed, and that's why we look to replace them for this year. If the iMacs and the iPads are removed from this year's budget, I will simply be asking for it next year. So we're just moving the purchases 1 year out, and we will make the situation a little bit more dire. I know we have a lot of new board members this year. We hit this scenario last year with the staff laptops. The staff laptops were 10 years old. We had been asking for it for a while. We hit a critical mass last year. We're in the middle of a pandemic year with remote learning, and the staff laptops were horrible. And rightfully so, staff members were incredibly frustrated because they're trying to do remote learning or remote teaching and their laptops were breaking. So we don't ever want our district to have go through that experience again. And that's why all of the equipment we have listed, we are utilizing them to the very tail end of their usable life. For instance, the core switch, that core switch is over 10 years old. At the end of this year, it is no longer supported by Ruckus, the company we bought them from. So we have to replace it. So we're not replacing it early. We're waiting until as the last possible moment to make sure that we are fully getting the value out of all of the equipment we have in the district.
Got it. I have a question about repairs and maintenance. What is that? That a reduction of from what number?
So this is really just in general, Tony, just for our facility related repairs. It's not in any one particular line item. Someone did raise a question, and I thank whoever that was, about a $9,500. Off of that 20,000, 10 is really just a correction of an error that we had in one particular item. I think that was related to athletics, and we just had that particular reduction. We combined two accounts, and we just combined the wrong account. But in terms of the other $20,000, you know, Tony, the board did ask for us to present a list, and we again, similar to legal fees and not increasing legal fees, we're looking at all the areas outside of the classroom to make our cuts. Mm-hmm. Now, again, a concern that I have as we reduce the various repair item is that we know that for the most part, our facilities are aged and things are constantly breaking, and we can never know at any given point what will break. But this is, we had to present something because as Lisa mentioned, over the past several years, we've been making cuts. We've been making cuts, and there really isn't a lot of places left to go. So we're going to reduce it. Really, the true cut is really 10. It's really 20, and again, we'll try to mitigate everything as best as we can.
Questions from comments from other board members?
I have a question about where we look for reductions. It's more procedural. It's easy to go after some of the simple things like the technology and, you know, can we hold off on replacement?
Yeah.
But just historically, when we look to try and find areas to reduce, does the district each year sort of more finally focus on a particular area? Or is it literally just everyone comes to the table, whether it's Dan, Mark, athletics, everything, and you look every place?
I think, you know, to answer that question, I think you look everywhere, but ultimately you come to the realization that the big items are really personnel related, right? And so you focus in on sections, right? In Hurlbut and in WIS, right? Versus your class guidelines. Whether you can take a risk on not adding a section. I think now, if I remember correctly, in Hurlbut, we're not really not really, we're keeping the number of sections the same. And so it's, you know, that discussion really centers around, you know, whether we believe the 114 versus the 130, but as Laura said, even if we end up in the 120s, we still need the same number of sections anyway. So it's really, ultimately, it really goes down to, you know, if there's a material change in the budget that needs to be really contemplated, it really, you know, you can knock off 30,000 here, 10,000 here, 20,000 here, 5,000 there. But ultimately, if there needs to be a big swing, it all goes back to FTEs, right?
And related to FTEs, do you have a sense, and is it budgeted, or there's really just no sense of knowing when you have retirements and changes like that, you know, natural retirements? Is that something that most teachers would say to you, Lisa, you know, I really love the district, but, you know, I love to, you know, take some time during the day to myself, and this might be my last year? Or do they literally springtime, they're thinking about next year and they come to you?
I would say it's a mixture of all above, David. Phil, perhaps you can talk about the early retirement, the ERIP, and the cost that's in the budget for next year and how often it's been offered.
Just before I do that, David, what direction are you just, can you add some more color to that question, please?
Yeah, I mean, I presume that, you know, being that one of our biggest costs are the teachers, and they're obviously the most important commodity or most important gift that we have, right? So as teachers retire and we have to look to new teachers, I would assume there's a cost associated with that. So really, my question, it circles more along the lines of, when we look at this year's budget, and then we look at next year's budget, is there thought given to potential retirements and what the cost might be when that teacher retires, who their replacement would be?
Right. So every year, David, we do have what's called turnover savings in our budget. So if you look in our current budget, there's a line that says turnover savings, and that's really a reduction to overall budget of about 115,000. So we do give consideration in that if a teacher does retire through natural attrition, we hope that the replacement will come in at a lower salary. So from that perspective, we do consider that, and that is a part of our budget on an annual basis.
Where is that in the budget, Phil, if they were going to want to see it?
Sure. Give me one quick second.
It's not in revenue, correct?
No, it's not. It's in salaries.
The other thing is, you know, we have offered ERIPs in the past. Sometimes people give us plenty of notice. Sometimes people don't. And I think it's even more volatile given the current situation that we're in. Dr. Crow, I don't know if you wish to add anything to that.
Thanks, Lisa. I think, you know, having given the ERIP last year and an opportunity for staff to take advantage of that, we may see fewer retirements than we typically would this year. As of right now, we have not received notice of any retirements at this point. But usually around this time, January, February, we would have, you know, a sense of if there are a couple out there, but you know, a lot of times it doesn't come till much later. It could be any time during the year. But like I said, I think last year's ERIP, and Phil, how many took advantage of the ERIP? 7 last year, or was it more?
I think it was ultimately 7.
Yeah.
And, you know, I know informally, people have said, hey, we offer in the ERIP this year. We can't offer it every year, which it's unfortunate for them, but it's not cost effective for us to offer it every year. Correct, Phil?
You know, it's like a double-edged sword, right? We do have a lot of great teachers in the district, and they've been in the district for several years now. But we have to from the district's perspective, we have to be very strategic in terms of our ERIP. I think we have offered an ERIP in close years. We did one last year at the very last minute, and there was one prior to that. I think it was in 1920 or so. So sometimes what we think we'll get from the ERIP, we do get it, and in some years we don't. So it just really goes to the questions as to ultimately what we're trying to achieve by the ERIP, because at the end of the day, right, you save that money in the first year, but you have to carry the cost of that ERIP for each year. Technically, so you see savings in 1 year, but then you're carrying that cost. So technically, you carry that cost for 2 additional years. So it's still a part of your budget, so to speak.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to add, and it was specifically in the area of enrollment and well, it's kind of also, it goes back to David's question about, how do we do this? I can speak to the way how we did this year, and it was similar in the past. So, you look at the district goals that we set, very clear goals in specific areas, and then you look the best that you can to make sure that those areas are supported. Here, specifically in math and language arts, in the area of portrait of a graduate and what that means at the high school with certain experiential courses, with the materials, everything is kind of through that lens. And basically, people put together the budget at the building level and the program level. And then, I'll be frank, I really pushed. I said, I'm great at playing devil's advocate continuously to the point where, okay, tonight's assignment is find $10,000 and, well, we can't find it. We can find it. It's up to us, or me, I guess, to articulate what the impact is. We had these conversations probably, guys, over the last, 2-3 weeks, even as much to 3 days ago, where, all right, what would the impact be? Put it on there, figure it out, go down to the granular level of seeing to make sure that we really have a solid understanding of how we are spending, how we're spending this $57 million of the proposal. An interesting thing about enrollment, for example, and when we look at class size and we look at, staffing and pushing it, like, can we, what would the impact be of the 1.0 to be determined at the high school? I have to say that I've been doing staffing a long time. Since I was an assistant principal, which is back in 2003, I started with staffing, knowing those numbers, looking behind it and all of that. And I think that I have a great foundational knowledge and seeing that picture, especially at the secondary level. Elementary schools, Patty and Laura are working with me on it. But when you look at the whole idea of asking for another section, for example, there's a document in your thing that says current enrollment and current sections that someone wanted specifically. And we had figures for the current enrollment, like these are the sections with the current class size. And Laura pointed out to me yesterday, she said, Lisa, this is how closely we watch these sections. Lisa, Laura Eagle had some kids in InfoSnap. What does that mean? Those InfoSnap kids are new kids that are registering, that are literally rolling over before the chart was completed or after the chart was completed to tweak those enrollments. So right now in kindergarten, what is it, Laura, 132? It's 132 in kindergarten. We thought it was 128, and we have 4 more just within the matter of a week. So that's why it's so volatile. And, I could take out the kindergarten section and add it to the list. It would be very easy to do that. However, what happens when we need it? Or what happens when we need the 3rd grade section? Because at 3rd grade right now, Patty, we're very close to the tipping point, correct? And my guess is we're going to go over like we did this year. I would feel that it was irresponsible of me to say, well, we'll put both of them on the list and get to the number, knowing that in a few months, we're going to have to ask the town for at least 1, if not 2. This way, if we have to ask, hopefully it's only 1, if I'm explaining myself.
There's another element, which is time. If you saw if you remember the timeline, when we get through with our budget in January, yes, we still have February and March where more information has come to life, and we always do updates, right? And so, Phil, what are the things that after January, you will also get a better picture on that might be significant.
Yeah, I think the big one that we're really waiting on is the premium increase from the state for the state partnership plan. So the state has been sending out very favorable information, right? A few weeks ago, I think I included that they did get reimbursement from the federal government of about $49 million that they're putting into the state partnership plan. In addition to that, we got an update yesterday, which is pretty much saying that the state that they're also projecting to be under 1%, meaning that for every dollar that they're getting for a premium, they're paying less than that out for claims. Their actuaries are saying that they're not, because there's still some volatility with overall claims experience, that they're not going to give us an early indication. But that could be significant, right? I mean, we're currently at about, I'm using a 6.5% for the increase for this year. For every 1% that it does reduce, we're looking at about, let's say, 85,000 or so in terms of a reduction. So that could be significant, right? So that's really the main item that we're waiting on. We may or may not get a better indication in terms of how things are trending as it relates to the SPED and PPS. So those are really the big ticket items, right? Because the SPED PPS will affect several different object codes that we have. Mm-hmm. So in terms of big ticket items, that would be it.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's very good that you do mention time, Tony, because again, as we always say, right, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. We started our process for us that as administration, we started our process in October. We started to build our budget in October. So our lens is really historical. We're in October. It's not until we really get to the February timeframe where we really get a better sense as to how things are really what the trajectory is for the new fiscal year. Tony knows, and the other from older board members, they know that I like to ask for time, because with time things become much clearer.
Yeah, it's a very perverse process because after we're done, there's 3 months before before the taxpayers get to vote on the budget, right? So there's a lot of time, and over that time, I think that's where experience has been that as we have discussions with Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance, as more information comes in, there's always an opportunity that these numbers move, right? And as a result, what happens is these numbers just don't move on their own. Every time something moves, we have to get together as a Board of Ed and approve it. So, so that, there are going to be actually several touch points where we have to get together as an entire board and look at potential adjustments to the budget that we approved in January. And reapprove an adjusted budget as well. So we have 15 minutes. I would suggest maybe start looking at them, how are you looking at the multi-year view of the budget? You have an updated one, Phil, but maybe you can talk a little bit about, kind of zoom out a little bit and look at potentially how this year and a couple of the other years ahead of us might look in terms of big items, right?
So as Lisa has been alluding to for the past in a couple of weeks, our biggest ticket item is really our salaries and our benefits. This is next year is the current contracts for all the bargaining groups will expire and we have to negotiate it. What I did in terms of the budget, so there's still some unknown there, right? And by law.
So you're going to refer to one of the multi-year budget on the Q&A.
Correct.
Okay.
Hold on one second. Let me try to get to it.
And you're starting with 2023, 24. So you're starting with not the one we're contemplating now, but
That's correct.
yeah.
So as you, let me, 1 second. I think we're talking about page 20, on page 20, that it references the multi-year.
Right.
You know, really, it's, and again, I guess, you know, each time we present it, last year was the first year we did it. And I know there's been discussions that we probably need to have a little bit more color to the various items with this, and we probably need to just have a separate discussion on the multi-year in our subcommittee meeting. But the lens that I view this is really, right, so you have your base budget. Once you have your base budget, what are those items that we think will increase over the next couple of years? For those items that we think will increase, those are the items that we have listed on the multi-year pro forma. We try to delineate as best as we can as to what those items are. Again, the big ticket item is going to be salaries. It's going to be salaries, and ultimately, what decision is made as it relates to health insurance.
So you're assuming that you took sort of an average of what has happened in the past, and for illustrative purposes?
For illustrative purposes, what I did for salaries is that I assume that what we currently have in place in terms of the contracts will be the contracts that are in place for illustrative purposes for the next 3 years. I also assume that we will remain with a state partnership plan, and I assume somewhat of an increase, annual increase for the plan as well. So that's pretty much a lens that I view those big ticket items.
So you haven't assumed. So for example, if we actually went to another plan and for some miraculous reason it saved us money, that's not included here.
That is not included here. I could try to get a sense as to what those numbers would look like. But I'm always just a little bit cautious, Tony, that we're not trying to negotiate before we're actually in negotiation. But because, as you know, we cannot do that by law. So I'm just trying to walk that line and just trying to be as clear as possible.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yes. Okay.
You know, I always say, right, in general, and this is just me saying this, in general, we do tend to be, when it does, we tend to have a 3% budget, just in base of our contractual increases and everything else that we have.
Well, you're also including the fact that we have to fund the 132,000. We have to fund. You're assuming we're going to fund the additional grant FT headcount.
Yeah, so my assumption is that we'll have the 235 coming back to the operating budget, which is for the SPED paraprofessionals, which is the 132. And also at the very bottom, increases from expired grants, that 130 there. 105.
Yep. So, you know, I think a lot of this, you know, when you look at, and what have you haven't made any assumptions on SPED PPS, right?
No, I assume that the SPED PPS the cost will not increase over in each of these years. I assume that level funding for the SPED PPS, because there's always the unknowns. So I don't want to assume that we're going to go up. So I just assume a level budget from our FY23 request.
Yeah.
You know, it's not going to be big dollars that we're talking about. I mean, we do have some contracts that will expire in some of these years. We have our bus contract that's going to expire in a few years. We have our contract with our cleaning company. And we have the contract for the Xenon plan. So again, so there may not be a lot of savings that would to be had from there, because just in terms of from where we are today and viewing things, just trying to outlook from where we are today and that lens in terms of what the current costs are, with inflation being what it is, it's difficult for me to say that things. I don't want to take the view that things are going to go down. So I'm just keeping everything a little bit level with some increases factored in.
Mhm. And you think that it's kind of interesting because, every place we slice it, if you don't have a significant, if you don't make a significant impact on benefits or the salary line, we're always, bottom line, we're always at that upper 2s to, low 3%.
Yeah.
Increase. And so the question really becomes around ultimately, so it's really more, a question to really pose to the town, right? Which is ultimately, this is ultimately without a very significant change in the way we run our school district. Roughly speaking, we've always kind of, except for some exceptional years, we've always kind of converged in that zip code, right?
Correct. Yeah, that was my exact thought. So every year, in essence, I've been here, and prior to that, as Lisa mentioned, we've always been making cuts. We're running out of those areas to cut, and as you can see, even from that reduction list that we have, we're piecemealing 10,000 here, 2,000 here to try to get to that big number. Yeah. But where you truly see that impact is as it relates to staffing. So the more we cut into the staffing, it is really a fundamental change in terms of how Western operates and in terms of the product that Western delivers.
Well, that's why it makes it even much more important to, and I don't know how other board members feel, but I think that's why it makes it that much more critical to really look at our benefits line, because that ultimately has a big impact, simply because of the fact that, every dollar we save on benefits, and obviously we don't want to erode we don't want to really erode the benefits package that we're offering our employees, but it does have a huge impact in terms of how we look at overall staffing levels. Right?
Yeah, and Tony, I have to point this out, right, because because I saw it, right. So it's similar to our ERIP. You get the savings in the first year. That's really what it is. So you get an opportunity to reset your budget in 1 year if we should make a significant change to the benefits package that we have, and only in the first year. But with healthcare being what it is, right, and every year, regardless of whatever plan or however it is, whatever the structure is, you're going to see those incremental increases. So every number of years, we're just going to have to reset and change a plan. So it's tricky. It's very tricky, Tony.
Yeah. We have about 5 minutes left before we have a hard stop at 12. I'd like to get, because we do have a couple of opportunities. We have the board meeting on Tuesday, and then the back end of the public forum on Thursday to do more work on the budget. And sort of I'd like to get some guidance from the rest of the board members as to where they would like to go with this. We can go right into what does everyone think of the budget? Or we could have some, if people need more info or dig into or have more questions, I guess everyone should in the next couple of days actually look at the Q&As to see if they're satisfied with the answers or there's more questions. But I'd like to get a good, some feedback from the board members as to the trajectory for the next couple of days, so that we can actually make sure that we have sufficient time to cover whatever else any of the board members would like to, where do people want to head from here? What?
Are we still at the 3.48 mark? We haven't made any changes on that, correct?
No changes.
And to piggyback on what Sharon said, it sounds to me like from a summary perspective, Lisa indicated there isn't any place, Lisa, if I have it wrong, certainly correct me, but it sounds like Lisa has indicated this is the barest of bare. There isn't any place that she said, oh, look, this would be a nice to have, not a need to have. Is that an accurate reflection, Lisa?
Yeah, I think so. When we look at and I've been looking at the spreadsheet and looking at different things. When we look at the 350 reduction, for example, if you were, because there's been a lot of talk about the social emotional piece and all of that, if you were to say, you know what, go back and see if you could put in the district school psychologist, which, we're still discussing, based on my configuration, we could comfortably cut, not comfortably, but we could cut the 300, that would bring it to 300,000, not 350. Other than that, you're looking at program. I mean, before that, okay, let's cut the Hurlbut Spanish program. We all did that. That's $75,000. Again, every time you look at a teacher, that's 108, where you flex it, but you'd have to go above class guidelines. You'd have to take away interventionists. I think that there's some sentiment that people say, well, take all the ESSER money and use it for the operating budget. Well, that doesn't get at the learning loss that we have with our children. We can't do that. We have to use it appropriately for the intervention. So, I welcome anybody else in the administrative team to add anything, but I think that right now, looking at the 350, or if we put that other position in and kept the paras out, that's still about 305 reduction. I do not know where else we would go. I mean, I know where we would go. I can say this is what's on the table. I would not recommend it.
In our budget book, I overlooked it. In the budget book, is there utilization? I don't know if utilization is the right word, but you talked, for example, about the Spanish course being cut at Hurlbut, which I presume you looked at it and the enrollment was such that you don't want to, but you look and you say, this is where we go. Does our budget book have, or is there a document that shows utilization or interest in classes at Hurlbut with the middle school and the high school?
Well, I can say, for example, for the Spanish program, 431 students use the Spanish program at Hurlbut. It's the total enrollment. When you look at the enrollment, it's not in any one place, it's in pieces. When you look at the staffing, for example, at the high school, and a lot of that also is based on student needs, you will see certain courses that are very popular, that's the enrollment. Do we have other documents? Yes. For example, we could, if you wanted to really look at something, you look at all of the stipends, because I know that's a hot topic at times. Look at all the stipends and say, you know what? Well, at all the stipends at the high school level, we're going to do what we do with the class size of 15, and we're going to look at all of them, because Julie has numbers. We can get you that document of how many kids participate in that club, if you will. You can do that. You can look at those numbers. Quite frankly, the amount that you're talking about cutting is not significant. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. I'm certainly trying to, if I'm getting at the heart of your question. But there's when you look at an interventionist and you think about the number of students that interventionist serves, or a para, we can quantify it the best that we can.
Yeah, I think that's the basis of the question, right? So if you look at the interventionist and you, like you said, you look at the number of students that interventionist serves, right? There's a lot of bang for the buck. I think that's the general
yes,
feeling, right?
Exactly.
So when you look at that, there's a lot of value, and the intent is that our students are going to do better. So if you had to look at the other end of the spectrum, or have you looked at the other end of the spectrum, where you may be saying, this is a great course that, you know, Weston offers, but when you look at it purely from a bang for the buck,
Yes.
we would be better off moving that cost someplace else. Do we have sort of that
Well,
lower?
yeah, I mean, I would say too, that's why we put the 1.0 reduction at the high school. And there's an answer, but there's a lot more details that go into that answer of how can we reduce 1.0 FTE at the high school. You know, what you do is sometimes you don't run certain amounts of sections of elective courses, or you look at a program and see how the program is doing. You look at, I mean, we get right down to the nitty gritty of looking at enrollment from, for example, you look at Spanish 5 and you try to predict who's going to go on to Spanish 6. We will take those class lists and look at every senior that won't be in there for the following year because they're taking it as a senior, count up those numbers of kids that are left and see and look, okay, is there going to be enough to run a section? That's how nitty gritty, I guess I would say, we get with some of these things. If you look at, you know, a course that you say, okay, this AP course that we're offering in science has, you know, 10 kids that are interested. By the time it schedules, it gets down to 8. We go and we ask Randy Green, if we didn't offer this class, how would it affect students on a particular trajectory to get into a particular college? Would that affect them? I mean, these are all the layers that we go through before we make a final decision. And as Tony said, a lot of that happens in the spring. I mean, you know, I often said that numbers in the high school staffing are so fluid because you don't know what the students are necessarily going to take. And we don't want to shut off avenues by not offering a particular course. Sometimes it's you have to, and it's not, we would like to. And then there are others where this group needs this last level of something to complete their program before they apply to college. So we do get at it, I would say, at that nitty gritty. We did that also with when we looked at, frankly, when we look at the music and the lessons at the middle school, and we made some tough decisions in looking at where we were going to reallocate FTE at the middle school. And we looked at the number of kids in those lessons. Is there a way with the period that's going to be longer? Can we reconfigure it? Perhaps it's not the ideal. I mean, you know, lessons at that level in some middle schools don't even exist. So we flexed and looked at it that granularly, I guess I would say. Right, Mr. Doak? I don't know if that helps, but to me, the devil is in the details. And that's the benefit of really knowing our kids and our program where, you know, I remember when I did the budgeting, I would sit there and go through class lists and, all right, we're taking out the seniors, we're taking out these kids. We're looking at who's going to continue in the trajectory. Go talk to the counselors to get the numbers as close as we can, because, you know, a 0.2 FTE, we have to spend it the very best possible way.
Any other comments? Questions? So I guess everyone should review the Q&A on the sheets from staffing on. And on Tuesday, if you have any additional questions on those pages, we should probably add that to the agenda for our, public, for our monthly meeting. We just add an agenda item so we can actually continue some of the deliberation. And, I think that we need to start developing a point of view. And so I think that's probably a discussion for potentially Tuesday and Thursday after the public forum. Okay. Anything else before we adjourn? Okay, thank you. Thanks for hanging in there. We're almost halfway done. So with that, can I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Okay, can I have a second?
Second.
Okay. All right. Meeting adjourned. Thanks, everyone. See you
Thank
soon.
you. Bye-bye.